growing food. I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, another one, and I was able to chat with him last week again, so it was great, and sort of catch up a little bit. And he's in a place of high connectivity, he said. Just like me, I sort of worry about whether my connection is going to go down in the middle of a production. But Carl Duivenvoorden was raised on a dairy farm in northern New Brunswick. And he graduated from NSAC, Nova Scotia Agricultural College, which is now Dal AC, in 1986 with the BSE. As very diverse agricultural interests early on took him to over 25 countries in his career. But from his early days in the village of Belledune, Carl always had an uneasy concern about human impact on our global environment. In 2006, he read An Inconvenient Truth. That's the book that catapulted a change in climate introduced a change in terms of our awareness of climate under the global agenda. In April of 2007, he became one of the first Canadians to be personally trained by former US Vice President Al Gore to present live versions of his Academy Award-winning slideshow. And since then, he's been working as a speaker, as a writer, a sustainability consultant, helping people and organizations learn how they can save money, energy, and our environment. Carl is conscious of deep linkages between climate change and food production. He hasn't milked a cow in quite a while, but he welcomes every opportunity to reconnect with his agricultural roots. So please welcome to our AGM, Carl Duivenvoorden.
Good morning, Ivan, and good morning, everyone. And Ivan, thank you very much for that nice introduction. Just first, a technical clarification, just to be sure. Are you able to hear well and also able to see slide number 1 with the planet on it and the title of the presentation? Perhaps, Ivan, you can nod or...
We can see the first slide. Your voice is a little bit low, but I can always turn it up here. Hopefully people can do that.
All right, very good. All right then. Well, good morning, everyone, and it is my pleasure to be here today. And I want to start by kind of apologizing for the bland name of this presentation, Food Production in a Changing Climate, because to be honest, I put my creative thoughts together and I thought, what can I do that's a little bit more creative? And I wanted to call it this. But then I looked at the program and I chatted with Ivan and realized it was already taken. So, well, here we are instead stuck with the bland topic title, I guess, Food Production in a Changing Climate. And when Kalisha first reached out to me back in, I think it was November, I thought, wow, this is awesome. Finally, a chance to be in front of a live audience again with all of the energy. And I have connections in Newfoundland. We've been over, our family, for vacation, and I've been over for speaking, I think at least 10 times. I have 2 sisters, both farmers. Jane is in Cormac and Pauline is down in the Corner Brook area. So I was really looking for, and Mama's over in Newfoundland now too. So I was really looking forward to coming. And then all of a sudden we get this coming along. OMG, Omicron. And well, you know what that calls for, right? Kalisha called right after Christmas and I thought, oh dear, I think I know what's coming. Food production in a changing climate, the home office version, except that the internet is not quite strong enough back in the home office. So I guess it required a drive into town. And here we are today with food production in a changing climate, the hybrid version. Before I get started, I wanted to elaborate a little bit more, if I could, on that background that brought me here today as your presenter. The journey from home on the farm, where I grew up in northern New Brunswick in the village of Belledune, to here today. Some of my fondest memories are from growing up on that dairy farm, and after doing all the things everyone does on a farm, I guess, I eventually went on to Agricultural College in Truro, and I got my degree in plant science. And for many years, I worked in agriculture, probably for about the first 2 decades. But change came a dozen years ago, and the roots of that actually go back to Belledune. Because you see, when I was a kid growing up in Belledune, there were 2 main industries sustaining the local economy, the smelter and the fertilizer plant. They're in this picture here, the fertilizer plant in the foreground, the smelter way in the back in the top right on the shore of the Bay of Chaleur. And when I was a kid growing up in Belledune, for my first 4 years of school, I went to the old Belledune School, which was located right there, where that red dot is, right between the two biggest, stinkiest industries around. And I can remember clearly as a kid, there were some days when, if it was cloudy and overcast, the smoke of the fertilizer plant would hang over our schoolyard like a fog. And we weren't allowed to go outside for recess. Or on marginal days, we might be allowed to go outside. We'd come back in and we'd have this burning taste in our throat. Not good, not good. I reached into the old family photo albums and dug out this. This is Pauline, Jane, and me going off to school. Jane's the tall one. We always let her go first, right? Well, all kidding aside, actually, you know, when I was a kid, I didn't know anything about the environment. Climate change wasn't even on the agenda. But one thing I did know was this, and I think any kid in grade 2 knows it, and it is you don't keep a car running in a closed garage because you'll poison yourself. People can die that way. And then I think, but wait a minute, isn't our planet kind of like a really big closed garage, except for the odd meteorite? Nothing comes in, nothing goes out. And then I'd look at that smoke coming out of that stack and I'd wonder, where does that stuff go? And the answer always seemed to be, goes away. Didn't work for me as a kid. And so the early seeds of concern that eventually led me to leave agriculture and start working in advocacy, speaking, writing, and consulting on environmental issues. So that's how I got here today. And I know what you might be thinking after you hear that story. You might say, oh, well, come on, Carl, that's just Baldoon. Except Baldoon might be a nice microcosm for this home, planet Earth. Author Paul Hawkins said, this planet came with a set of operating instructions, but we seem to have misplaced them. Important rules like don't poison the water or the soil or the air, and don't touch the thermostat. Well, those rules have been broken. So over the next hour-ish, here's what I'd like to share with you. I'd like to start off by covering a bit on climate change, essentially the things that keep me awake at night. And then I'd like to talk a bit about where we are, where we need to go in terms of emissions, and then I'll touch on agriculture. And I'll confess right off that my background in farming goes back sometimes, so far be it for me to suggest any expertise in modern agriculture, but I think you'll hear more tomorrow. You're already hearing it from Ivan, and you'll hear more tomorrow from tomorrow's speaker, Cedric. So let's get started then. And to do that, I'm wondering if I could use the chat a little bit in this, because sometimes big, long presentations that you just sit and watch, I get it. Zoom fatigue. So maybe we can use the chat on this, and hopefully it works from my end here too. But I'd like to hear from everybody out there. First of all, just maybe put it in chat and share it with everyone. On a scale of 1 to 10, how concerned are you about climate change? And maybe keep that chat box handy because, excuse me, because I've got about a half a dozen or so references here to chat where I'd like to reach out to you. So let's see what the chat box says. I see some 5s popping up. Okay, oh, someone's got an 8, ooh, a 10 from one of our presenters, I think, as I saw it fly by there. Very good, 8, 6, 7. Okay, this is good to see. I think we're all kind of in the same space on this, I gather. So let's carry on then with the first part of this presentation, which is what I call what keeps me awake at night. And here's where it starts. You recognize that? It's what happened to my credit card balance when I decided not to pay it for a while at 20% interest, right? Just kidding, it's exponential growth. And in this case, it's applicable to an awful lot of what we do these days and an awful lot of the trends that are happening out there, whether human population, consumption of virtually every resource, or in this case, I'd like to focus on our consumption of oil, coal, and natural gas. Because we pretty much know that's behind climate change, but I think a lot of us fail to appreciate the role of exponential growth in our consumption. And maybe to help that, it would be helpful to consider the significance of 1993. Because you see, if you imagined all of the fossil fuels burnt by humanity since the start of the Industrial Revolution to today, 50% of it has been consumed since 1993, in the last 29 years. That's since 1750, roughly. I mean, I don't know about you, but that blows me away because that's not just in my lifetime, that's in my post-NSAC professional lifetime. Put another way, if you imagine the timeline from 1750 to today as 1 hour, it means half of everything consumed in that hour has been consumed in the last 6 minutes. That's exponential growth. And we look at this and we say, yeah, but that's just a little graphic, right? But look how it overlays on actual emissions. Oy, 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 oy. It's true, we did have a pause during the pandemic, but poof, we've got a lot of pent-up demand waiting out there, and it seems like we're ready to carry on unabated not so long after that. And it's to the point where today, well, how long does it take to generate 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide globally? Less than a second. Over 100 million tons every single day of the year. So, well, let's look at where does that land locally. Here's the emissions pie chart for Newfoundland and Labrador. And I think this dovetails nicely with one of Ivan's last slides, right? You see some of those biggest slices there, and then you see the small one with the green arrow, agriculture and other, 1%. A little more on that to come, though, because as he'd indicated, well, it's not quite cut and dry. But back to you for a second now, just to check in on emission sources. What do you think, perhaps via the chat, what do you think is Newfoundland and Labrador's single largest source of emissions? Anyone want to chime in on that? Single largest source of emissions. I see a guess at the refinery at Come By Chance from Joshua. Transport, oil refinery, oil and gas. Okay, anyone else? Okay, transportation. All right, very good. In this case, I was looking for the biggest single source, and in fact, it did come up. I think it was guess number one. Come By Chance refinery, because there it is. 1 ton every 22 seconds. So it would have emitted a ton on average, well, every 22 seconds of the year. So it would have likely emitted a ton during the time it took us to do that little poll just now, that little chat. And the second one, well, it's Holyrood, the big thermal generating station. It's a ton every 29 seconds. So probably it's emitted a ton about since we started that chat. Notice, interesting again, in furtherance of what Ivan hinted at, no agriculture right there, right? Those are the two biggest single sources of emissions in Newfoundland and Labrador. Well, then here's another exponential growth curve, and that's the level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, also heading up in an exponential way. Here's where it started back at the Industrial Revolution, 277 parts per million. Fast forward to 1962, a really important year, for me at least, because it's the year I was born. But you see, already then, we're up to 320 parts per million. But fast forward to this week. And as of Monday, 416 parts per million. And again, if you look at that, we're off the charts. And if you look at that increase, it blows me away that 70% of that increase has happened in my lifetime. And again, I don't feel very old, but once again, that is exponential growth happening in the chemistry of the atmosphere around us. And we're starting to see symptoms, right? The hottest 8 years on record in the past 8 years. And even locally, we're seeing records. I mean, take a look at this. Weather records happen, right? Because weather's a chaotic system. The only thing is, in a stable climate, you'd expect that you set the same number of new record highs and new record lows. And look what happened in the last 4 months of last year. Not even close. 125 new record highs, a single new record low. Well, as Joel Salatin said, folks, this ain't normal. Well, unfortunately, there's still a little more too, because I do get that when it comes to talking about climate change, talking about all the hazards of a warming planet is a really tough sell on what's turning out, at least on my end of the camera here, to be one of the coldest days in January. It's a tough sell, if only it were temperature, but there are so many other things connected. In fact, I like to nominate the octopus as the official mascot of climate change because it has many tentacles that reach all over the place. So back over to you for another chat once again. What do you think will be the biggest impact of climate change on Newfoundland and Labrador? Maybe you'd enter that in the chat. We'll just take 30 seconds or so. But what do you think will be the biggest impact of climate change on Newfoundland and Labrador? Anyone ready to go? Sea level shows up. Extreme weather. A more variable climate. Ocean warming. Weather. Complete disruption. Oh, yeah. Erratic weather. New pests and diseases. It's good to see those roll in because they're all thoughtful and well-founded responses. Yeah. Let's take a look at what the government's website would say. Turn Back the Tide talks about 4 main risks. And I'm not going to cover the increasing sea surface temperatures. I think it's a little bit less apropos to us here in agriculture, but I will cover the other 3. And let's start with increasing air temperatures. Here's a chart from a study that was done in 2013 anticipating where temperatures would increase by mid-century. And a little side note, summer and winter are reversed on those in that graphic because the winter temperatures will actually rise more so than the summer. The intuitive response might be, oh, that's a good thing, warmer winters more than summer. But that's the study in 2013. Fast forward to 2018 and an update was done. And look at the changes. I mean, the models are changing, the forecasts have jumped way up, like way up. And sometimes we say, well, that's just a few degrees and won't that be a good thing? That will bring us more heat units. And it may lead some to say, climate change could be a really good thing for us. Well, in the short term, perhaps, yeah, but I liken climate change to a train. And perhaps we're waiting at the station for that train to come in and hoping that it'll stop and give us a lift. That train's not scheduled to stop in our station or anywhere until the energy fueling that train slows it down. So it's going to plow right through. All that to say, sure, warmer temperatures may give us a short-term bump in terms of our ability to grow crops or more heat units. But in other areas where it's warmer, I can tell you it's turning warm into really, really hot. And the climate maps for New Brunswick bear that out. So there's number 1, increasing air temperatures. Here's number 2 to cover, sea level rise. And it's nice to see that showed up in the chat as well. Here's the map from Turn Back the Tide, the government publication. Sea level rise by the end of the century anticipated to be as high as 1 meter. That's a lot of water. Now, the nice thing is, if you look at the shoreline of Newfoundland, lots of rock, lots of cliffs, and generally pretty high shorelines, which is a good thing. The only thing is, time doesn't end at the end of the century, and you wonder, well, where does this stuff come from? A little bit on the science of this, because I gather, again, sea level rise is often underappreciated. We know that the Arctic ice is melting, right? The only thing is, in that red circle, the Arctic ice cap is floating ice. So as it melts, it's like an ice cube in a glass of water. It doesn't change the level of water in the glass. The only thing is, right next to it is this, a sheet of ice on Greenland, which is the size of all of Quebec. And it's pretty deep too. It's pretty extensive. There's a lot of ice in Greenland and it's sitting above sea level. So if it were to melt and fall into the water, or that water run into the ocean, well, that does affect sea level. So here's another chat for you. And I won't be doing this all the way through, but the start has a few more of them. Here's a question for you. A pop quiz, let's say. And it's a good way via Zoom to check in if everybody's still awake too, of course. Right? So if all the ice in Greenland were to melt, by how much would world sea levels rise? You see the 5 options there? Any guesses in chat? Let's see what we've got. See a couple of 4s. See a couple of 5s. So 3 flash by. I hope it isn't 5. Oh dear. With considerable regret, I will share with you, it's 5. There's a lot of ice locked up in Greenland, 3 kilometers deep. in the middle of Greenland, 3 kilometers of ice, 6 times the height of the CN Tower, and we're seeing a little bit more of this. Now, to be sure, it's a long, slow process, not going to happen overnight, but there's a lot more of this, like 10 times this amount waiting down in Antarctica. And there are rumblings down there as well. So sea level rise is a big deal. And this past summer, there was rain on top of the highest point of Greenland for the first time since we've been recording. So sea level rise is a big deal, and those maps indicate perhaps just the start of it, unless we can stop that train of climate change. And here's the third option, increase in extreme weather. And it was good to see, I sense a lot of awareness here. It was good to see that show up in the chat too. A little bit on the science behind that. It's straight physics that when water warms up, here's the water cycle, of course, continuous evaporation of water, it moves through the air, it condenses, comes down as snow or rain or other forms of precipitation. Well, when we get warmer oceans, warmer water, it's simple physics, it evaporates more quickly. Well, that's happening. That was a story from just a week ago. Gulf of St. Lawrence is warming. In fact, a lot of the ocean is warming. So that means that we're getting more evaporation happening. Warm air, climate's warming, warm air can carry a much bigger load of moisture, which means we get much bigger dumps of water happening. And here's a slide from the 2018 update of that study that was done in Newfoundland, and it shows the increases in extreme precipitation events. You know, you can look at the numbers, you can see the increases mid-century, end of century, or maybe you can just look at this, right? Because it hits home, it hit home 2 months ago in the southwest of Newfoundland. Burgeo got lucky, only 3 inches of rain, right? Whereas around Port aux Basques and Codroy area, it was double that and even more, with a result like this, which is pretty inconvenient, especially when a lot of your food comes across that road. And pretty darn expensive to fix too. And here's perhaps the one takeaway slide I think that makes it clearest, and that is right here you see, and this is from the slide deck that was associated with that 2018 study about impacts in Newfoundland and Labrador. And you see that box, it says that a 1 in 100 year storm today in the Deer Lake area, that's this slide, a storm that happens 1 in 100 years today, go towards mid-century, and that's happening between, well, they say between 1 and 5, 1 and 10 years. To me on the graph, it looks more like between 1 and 8 and 1 and 20 years. But the point being, all of a sudden, these big extreme events that were really, really rare start to happen a lot more often. In 2013, the initial study said Newfoundland's going to get warmer, wetter, and stormier. The update, appropriately, even warmer, even wetter, even stormier. So there are the impacts of climate change, but here's another big one too, I think. And that is the uncertainty that goes with it all and the strain it puts on us. I mean, I get the sense the pandemic has brought new revelations about the importance of good mental health and how it's putting strain on a lot of people. Well, I think farmers have been in that space already for a variety of reasons. And here is now climate change pounding another one on top of all of that. And you know, this is the start of it. I regret that there are so many other things that could be covered as well, like invasive species or changing habitats of whales, or acidification of our oceans as they absorb more carbon dioxide, or species diversification, or just plain discomfort from heat. All of these other impacts, all of these other tentacles of climate change, and all of this interconnectedness reminds me of one of my favorite quotes of all time from Chief Seattle 170 years ago. Man does not weave the web of life, he's merely a strand in it. And whatever he does to the web, he does to himself, because all things are connected. Oof, all things are connected. So, well then, what's needed? Well, to get into that, let's start with this. I regret it's a bit of going back to school, I guess. But here's the carbon cycle. It's one of the main cycles driving continuously on planet Earth, because carbon's a very mobile element. It moves up into the air every time we exhale, or when something rots or decomposes, or when anything is burned, from wood to anything that we burn. It comes back down thanks to anything that's green. And that would be trees and grasslands and algae in the ocean, a big one as well. And for millennia, the carbon cycle has been largely in balance. Same amount of carbon going up as coming down. But in some parts of the world, on the left side of the graph, the ability of photosynthesis is being impaired a bit because we're having a lot of deforestation or even desertification happening afterwards as well. So we're impairing the down draw side of the carbon cycle. And then on the right side of the chart, well, we have this happening. We're digging up fossil fuels that have been safely locked out of the equation, like locked out of the cycle for not decades or centuries or millennia, for millions of years. For millions of years, we're digging them up because of the magical work they do for us. I get that. But you see what that does to the cycle. We're accelerating the right side, we're impairing the left side. Things get out of kilter, and you see that there's a bunch of carbon that builds up in the atmosphere. Well, the simplest solution then is that we need to rebalance our carbon cycle somehow. If we want to get a little bit deeper into it, in 2018, there was a report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's body of experts from countries all around the world. And they concluded that if we keep going with business as usual, this is where we're headed with our emissions. In fact, with a bit of an exponential curve uptick to it. But if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and what we're seeing right now in terms of crazy weather, that's about 1 degree so far. So only a 0.5 degree buffer still to go. If we want to limit warming, then this is what needs to happen to emissions. We need to drop by 45% by 2030. Not of where we are today, but where we were by 2010. So that's a pretty steep down curve. And then we need to finish the job and go all the way to net zero by 2050, another 20 years after that. And that may seem like a long time, but that's when a baby born today will be 48 years old. Sorry, 28 years old. That's not very long. And we can look at that and maybe you're like me, you're thinking, wow, that is a steep curve, and by any measure, that is going to require a bit of action and ambition. To put a number to it, 45% down by 2010 will require 1% every 2 months, if you do the simple math between now and 2030. That's pretty significant, 1% every 2 months. So if you're like me, you're looking at this and you're thinking, whew, we could sure use a magical source of clean energy we could just connect our cables onto now and get everything we need. And oh dear, the unfortunate news is, as far as we know now, that does not exist. There's no silver bullet that'll get us out of this. But the good news is there is silver buckshot. In other words, there is a whole combination of technologies, each of which can bend the line down just a bit. And combined, all of them together can take us to where we need to go. They can. So what are those slices? Well, most of them begin with the same 2 words: more efficient. Vehicles, public transit, commercial buildings, residential buildings, urban design, more efficient, you name it, everything. And then there's a big one as well, that is renewable energy. And it's nice to see in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's one of the cleanest grids in the country, which is a really good thing. And I get that there are a lot of challenges with that photo on the left, but in the end, it seems to me that's still a good thing, because whenever the initial impact and the financial impact is gone, there's a lot of non-emitting energy sitting behind that dam right there waiting. And then the wind turbines, solar panels, also non-emitting energy. These are solutions that, well, I'm guessing will be ramped up more and more onto the grid going forward too. But as Ivan alluded to a little bit earlier, there's a little bit more to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions than simply that very first one that we always hear about, carbon dioxide. Because you see, it's the bulk of emissions by far. But whenever you look at emissions by impact, the pie changes a little bit, and 2 others start to take disproportionate shares in terms of how many tons are actually going up. That would be methane and nitrous oxide. It's because they have more potency for warming once emitted into our atmosphere. 1 ton of methane emitted up into our atmosphere has the equivalent warming potential in our thin blue blanket, the atmosphere of planet Earth, as 25 tons of carbon dioxide. 1 ton of methane, 25 tons of carbon dioxide. It's even more dire for nitrous oxide. about 300 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for every single ton of nitrous oxide that is emitted. And that last category, well, those are F gases are refrigerants. Sometimes you hear about those in the news to do with the ozone layer and also with climate change, F gases. So then, well, let's look at Canada's emissions. Let's step back from Newfoundland and look at national emissions. And you see, there's our pie chart. 2 big slices, 3 roughly equal slices, and then 2 smaller slices. And you see agriculture as 10%. But in furtherance of what I've mentioned as well, fair bit of ambiguity in that 10%, because you see, when you drill deeper, you find this on Agriculture Canada's website. 10% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions are from crop and livestock production, excluding emissions from the use of fossil fuels or from fertilizer production. So where's that 10% coming from? Well, enteric fermentation. That would be, the media loves to say cow farts, right? They get to say fart on the air, it seems. In fact, it's mostly cow burps, like 95% of that methane from animals. But the point being, it's a big source of methane, cattle. And when it comes to nitrates, well, it's a big source of nitrogen fertilizers applied to the land. I mean, nitrates are naturally emitted through natural processes, but when we use a lot of fertilizer, we accelerate those processes and we get more nitrous oxide emitted from our soils. And then both of them can come from manure, depending on how we manage it and how we apply it. That's where the 10% is primarily coming from. So then when we revisit this chart, we start to think, wait a minute, then that means we've got roots in several other slices, like transportation to get all the grain or fertilizer to our farm, oil and gas. Well, everybody has part of that one. Electricity to run our operations, and this one, industry. Ivan alluded to it as well, and it's good to see there's growing awareness about it. One of the big chunks of industry would be that manufacturing of nitrogen fertilizers, ammonium nitrate, from essentially natural gas in the atmosphere. A lot of energy, a bit of nitrogen from the air, and we get ammonium nitrate, and it's intensive in terms of emissions and also in terms of our pocketbook this year as well. Perhaps that becomes a bit of a feedback loop that will help us to use less. But you see, it's interesting, that whole nitrogen piece, I was kind of shocked or more dumbfounded perhaps when that first came to me a few years ago about the footprint of the manufacture of nitrogen fertilizers. It's very significant. And it's something that's almost exclusive to agriculture, I think. So then let's come back to Newfoundland and Labrador's emissions, and we have our 1% slice, of course, which is very small to the point where you'd say, well, of course we have to focus on the big slices. That's true, but we also have a part in those other 3 slices. And again, the industrial one, in terms of the nitrogen one, well, that's imported to the island. That's part of somebody else's slice and one too. So all that to say, Ivan said it's a little fuzzy. It is a little fuzzy. But to the point where we are in climate change, I guess every slice, every bit matters. So, well, what's the way forward? Well, I don't profess to have all of the answers, and I get the sense that this can be a little bit wearying. So as opposed to talking about a whole bunch of tiny practices, I thought, let's boil it down to 4 key points, perhaps. Number 1, strive to manage methane in the best way you can. In the past, perhaps we've seen manure as a disposal problem. Perhaps we need to look through a different lens and always see it as a resource to be preserved as best we can with minimal losses. When it smells, it's unpleasant for the neighbors perhaps, but it also means that we're losing a part of that valuable resource, which can displace some of that, some of those imported chemical fertilizers that also have come with their footprint and their financial costs as well. So be really almost obsessed with effective manure management. And here's the other one too. I mean, if we're talking about methane and a lot of it comes out of the mouth of a cow, then I suppose we should be as attuned as we can be to new technologies that will help us reduce that. I mean, whenever cows burp out methane, obviously it's a greenhouse gas, but it's also a loss of a bunch of that energy that we have paid to that cow to eat for other purposes, be it meat or milk products. So maybe that means keeping an eye on things like additives or supplements that can help reduce the reactions in the cow's digestive system that lead to that methane. And then we can keep more of that energy in the cow and get more efficiency from our feed as well. So that's number one, strive to manage methane, and perhaps to change our thinking about it, always be cognizant of where is methane coming from and what can I do about it. Number two, minimize nitrates. Number three, build soil carbon. Haven't really touched too much on this yet, but the two of them kind of go together because they're pretty similar. You see, in the top left photo, that's precision agriculture. That's a precision agriculture map, and it speaks to the need to perhaps get a bit more specific and careful about our applications of fertilizer. Precise, small applications, maybe more of them, maybe less overall, maybe greater use of organic matter because it offsets fertilizer, but also helps build up that soil carbon. On the lower left, minimal tillage, because for the most part, tillage, when we do it, awakens the microbes in the soil and they start to do what they do, and we start to lose organic matter and we start to emit more nitrogen as well. More legumes, where, if possible, incorporate manure. And I get that the scale of agriculture in Newfoundland doesn't lend itself in some instances to the type of technology that might be there, or maybe the topsoil doesn't lend itself to that either, right? But the point is, where possible, let's strive to preserve as much of that as possible. And, you know, it's interesting, I think Ivan alluded to this earlier too, there is a benefit in Newfoundland, I believe, Newfoundland and Labrador, in that the scale is not up to the massive scale in other areas, which means that it gives an inherent capability to perhaps be a little more nimble and to get it right the first time, as opposed to try to step back and correct further down the line. And then finally, on the right, there's a cow in the woods, because silvopasture is indicated as a way to sequester more carbon in our soil as well. And it was good to see it showed up on Ivan's slide earlier too. Remember this slide about where we are with our level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere? If you look at stability on the planet, it's believed by climate scientists it looks like this, 350 parts per million. So that means not only do we need to stop the rise, but somehow we need to bring it back. A challenge. I mean, stopping is a challenge, first of all. A couple of years ago, this book came out, Drawdown, with a whole bunch of solutions to reverse, stop and reverse climate change. And the book has evolved now to a website, but when I never read the book, but I read up about it and looked at its, I believe it was 80 solutions, and I think 13 of the top 20 involved agriculture and land use in one form or other. And now you can go to the website, drawdown.org, and here's a screenshot of all of the solutions that relate to agriculture. And look, I've just highlighted 5 of them that it seems to me would be pretty major ones. I mean, the one in the top right, I'm not sure we'll ever bring giraffes back to Newfoundland again, but the point being, grasslands are a good way to sequester carbon, and the less that we till, conservation, tillage, regenerative, cropping, nutrient management, and of course, evolving ourselves to eating more veggies, more plant-rich diets. These are all part of the solutions in Drawdown. So then, well, let's go to the 4th priority, and that would be, see what we can do to nibble at those other slices. Because again, there's a lot on our shoulders here, I get that. Those other slices, well, those would be our use of fuel, use of electricity. So that means perhaps transforming our culture as much as we can to the point where conservation becomes second nature. It becomes part of what we do. Use less energy in every way possible. Turn every switch off that we can when something isn't in use. Turn the engines off when we're not driving, because we bought that fuel to drive. And perhaps also planning trips a bit better so we drive less. Remember, transportation, massive slice, right, of our emissions. And then there's the new technology piece. I think one of the ones that's out there, and I don't think the adoption of it is widespread just yet, would be something like a variable speed vacuum pump. And I get the sense that that's even more important now, where we have robotic milkers that run 24/7. So the vacuum pump is always going. Well, variable speed vacuum pumps provide just the amount of power and vacuum that is needed by the system at the time. And I get that this is from Bomatic, a supplier, so you might want to take that claim a little bit with a grain of salt. But look at that, on-farm trials produce electrical savings of more than 60%. It strikes me that that leads to a fairly quick payback too. Fans are sometimes big users on farms as well. So when the time comes to change the motor, look for the most efficient motor you can get in the new versions of it. When it comes to transportation, well, the electric truck was announced last May. This was the Ford F-150 Lightning. Pretty cool, with all kinds of power, with all kinds of range, and this is a pretty futuristic possibility, it seems to me, because Ford in their advertisements is already saying now you can run your house on this truck, provided you have the right wiring, for up to 3 days because the battery is so enormous. In other words, you don't need a generator. That in itself, pretty appealing, it seems to me, because remember, in Newfoundland and Labrador, the grid overall is pretty clean. I believe Holyrood is scheduled to be shut down in the next year or two as Muskrat Falls comes on. Pretty good green electricity. More we can convert to electricity, the better. And then the other nice perk is it's got all kinds of outlets on it, so that if you're doing field work that requires like a chop saw or some other piece of electrical equipment, don't need to bring a generator. Just plug it into the truck and away you go, and then fill up the truck again at night whenever you're at home. So pretty nice. Chevy, a little later to the game. Here's their answer. Came out just earlier this month. It was announced. Totally redesigned. Looks nothing like the old Silverado, I guess, but look at the power and look at the range, all that. Other vehicles on the farm, well, this little guy might be a helper. I think these are used on a lot of farms for some of the lighter jobs like fencing. And do you know what you get? What happens when you Google electric tractors? That. But also this. That's a hobbyist version, I think. Although I'll look at that and I'll say, wow, that's kind of cool. A solar panel with a whole bunch of batteries sitting there, self-sustaining, self-powering tractor potentially. Tinkerer's dream. But also this, look at that, that's on the market now in Europe. I think it's like a 50 horsepower-ish tractor. Runs for 5 or 6 hours, I believe, something like that. Or these days it's this. I've given this presentation before and put up the big electric tractor that John Deere was prototyping. I think they have determined that now when it comes to the really big tractors that require a lot of power, batteries aren't quite there yet. So instead, here's what their latest prototype is on a big long tether. You say, poof, doesn't look very feasible. It's still a prototype. It's in trials, but this is kind of neat. In really big areas, like some of Ivan's cousins' farms, perhaps, you know, the larger scale agriculture, you can do what they call platooning and string a whole bunch of these together. My cable, it's a kilometer long. And according to the website, it never tangles. So I guess we'll see how that will all work as well. Point being, electrification is coming. And hopefully we are ready to receive it when it comes, because anything that helps us use less fossil fuels in our industry is bound to be a good thing. And when the time comes, well, maybe once we've got our load of electricity as low as possible, maybe creating our own renewables is an option. Here's a farmer in New Brunswick who refers himself to now to a sun farmer as well as a dairy farmer, 132 kilowatt power array on his farm. And it's paying for itself. Newfoundland doesn't quite have the sun intensity of New Brunswick when you go to solar maps, and there aren't programs out there yet to support solar. But we're on to, I think we can look forward to some pretty aggressive federal programs to help us reduce emissions. So keep an eye on when solar power will come, because here's the beauty of a lot of larger farms. There's a really big roof there. And roll the dice, whether that is facing south or reasonably south, and is therefore your natural place for your own power plant, which drives down your own power bill too. Renewable energy in larger areas may take the form of this. Larger dairy farms could probably manage this. This is a shot from Wisconsin, and if you happen to be near an urban area where you might be able to get some additional organic matter, whether from municipalities or whether from compost programs or something like that, could be a good thing, because it results in, I believe, a more stable organic matter that you can apply, but also results in that methane generated being turned into electricity, renewable power. I know there's a successful operation here in New Brunswick that way, and a smattering, I believe, across the country as well. And I wanted to quickly touch on solar once again with a small real world example. And that is at home in our own yard. Last year, we installed one of these guys. It's not a big array. There are 16 panels in it. It's 6.4 kilowatts. And it's got a bunch of technology in the basement and all that type of thing. And I won't bore you with a lot of details, but I do think this is the part that is of interest to most people, because that's a snippet of our power bill at home. And that's for our house and also charging an electric vehicle. And you see that red arrow? That's where the panel was installed a touch over a year ago. The gray line was our power consumption in kilowatt hours the year before. And then you see what happened to it after the panel was installed. It's going to take a while to pay for itself, no doubt about that. Payback a dozen years, maybe a touch longer because of a few fancy options we have on ours. But the point is, my current power bill will never pay for itself. It's a bill in perpetuity. So any payback to me strikes me as a whole lot better. And this is, well, clean green energy as well. Well, I have no way of checking to see if this really is you on the screen just now. I'm hoping it's not, but it's getting fairly close to the time to wrap up. But I'd like to close with a few final thoughts here. This is an image of Earth from space, from the International Space Station. You see the atmosphere there, that thin blue blanket all the way around the planet that is responsible for the air we breathe, but also for keeping us at the perfect temperature for life. In the world of explaining climate change, the analogy is often used that if Earth were the size of an orange, that atmosphere that sustains us all around us would be no thicker than a coat of paint on the orange. I have come over the years to really appreciate the role of topsoil in sustaining us as a much underrated resource. Topsoil, that thin layer all the way around Earth from which we get, I think it's like 99.5% of our food, essentially everything but about except seafood, originates from topsoil. And it occurred to me, if you assumed a meter of topsoil around the planet, to use this orange analogy, how big would the orange have to be to equate to topsoil being as thick as a coat of paint on the orange? How big would the orange have to be if we assumed a meter of topsoil? The answer to that, do a few calculations, and you find out that the orange would have to be 10 kilometers in diameter. Let's put that another way. Here's Bell Island. Bell Island is about 10 kilometers long. So if you imagine planet Earth as an orange, the size of Bell Island, all of that topsoil from which we get over 99% of our food would be no thicker than a coat of paint on an orange the size of Bell Island. There's not much there. And in doing that math, I estimated a meter of topsoil, and I was thinking, I don't think there's a meter of topsoil in Newfoundland. I know there isn't in New Brunswick either, which speaks to the orange being even bigger. Point being, that topsoil is so valuable, so precious. And we have to do all we can to protect that. You know, I was chatting with a guy on Prince Edward Island last week who runs this program, ALUS, Ultimate Land Use Program. It's actually on PEI, it's a government funded program whereby they pay farmers to keep land out of production, specific land that is over, I think it was a 9% slope, so it doesn't erode. You can put grassland on it and you can harvest forage, but no row crops. Same for buffer zones near rivers. So the laws say 50 feet, I think. Well, you're allowed to increase that and get paid for it, like $75 an acre a year. And the last one is I think in ravines or hollows in the bottoms of fields where a lot of eroded soil would normally accumulate and then run down the hollow. Paid. And it's interesting, in chatting with the coordinator of this program, he quoted Aldo Leopold, ecologist, soil farmer, basically, who said, you know, soil is a public good. To some extent, there is a real good rationale for saying there's a public interest in preserving that topsoil. Hence this program on PEI. I get the sense that coming down the pipe are opportunities for more creative solutions, maybe as part of some of these big bundles of money that are available from Ottawa. Perhaps there's room for a program something like this. PEI's is the only one in the country that is government funded province-wide. There's a smattering of them. If you go and find the website, there's a smattering of them that are over that are over across the country. Whenever Kalisha booked me to speak here, I asked, well, Kalisha, what does this audience need to hear? And she said, well, you know, farmers are getting a little bit weary because sometimes they're portrayed as kind of the bad boys. And it struck me as kind of appalling, but Ivan kind of reinforced that a while ago with those finger pointing slides, right? It seems to me that's a bit bizarre because when I go to the website of Food First Newfoundland, I see these beautiful graphics of just how important food security is in Newfoundland, how much there is a need for growing more. Maybe it speaks to a bit of better messaging. Maybe it speaks to forging new relationships. Maybe it speaks to really sharing those big success stories that you have so that everyone is on your side. Because it seems to me growing more is exactly what you need to do. It's true, no one is exempt when it comes to doing our best to fight climate change, but let's keep it proportional, because the one thing I know to be a universal truth is this: everybody needs to eat, and agriculture is what provides that. Just a week ago, Ivan, I think I'm still okay for time, right? I'm just about ready to wrap up. Okay, very good, thanks. I don't want to bump into others' time. A couple of weeks ago, I was listening to hearings here in the province for the new climate action report. And one of the speakers was your speaker tomorrow, Cedric McLeod, speaking about the perspective of agriculture. And when asked the question, he said, you know, we're speaking here about the need for a fundamental cultural shift. Fundamental cultural shift. And it made me think of this quote from Albert Einstein: we can't solve our problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we first created them. Or my own take on that would be, maybe we need to rethink everything we hold to be true. Oof, that's big, isn't it? Challenging us to rethink all of our beliefs that we hold to be true, all of our paradigms. Look, I can't tell you how many of my paradigms have been challenged since I started doing this work a dozen years ago, and how many changes it's forced me to make, because I'd like to think that I'm an evidence and data person striving to do the best. Imperfectly, but striving. Seems to me, perhaps we all have to be open to seeing our paradigms challenged and reconsidering a lot of our beliefs. Some people say, oh, well, we'll just adapt. Well, further to the train that won't stop quite yet, I found this quote, I think, that speaks to the need to mitigate as well as adapt. Annie Leonard wrote a couple of years ago, if your home was flooding because you'd left the faucet on, your first step when you come home wouldn't be to start mopping. You'd first cut the flooding off at its source, the faucet. Unfortunately, when it comes to climate change, the floor is wet. There's already water down there, and it's true that we have to adapt somewhat. We got to get out the mop and get working, but we also really, really, really need to work on mitigation. Nice to see that agriculture is moving into that space like everyone else too. It's nice to see this organization, Farmers for Climate Solutions, national network of farmers concerned about climate change and committed to doing better and to sharing information as well. I spend a lot of time in the space of climate change and pondering how are we going to fix this. And you know, for me, it kind of comes down to two main things. One, it seems to me that we need to start looking at the world perhaps through a different lens. Instead of the previous lenses of how much will this cost? How simple is it? How convenient is it? What will my friends think? Maybe we need to look at all of our decisions through a different lens. The lens of sustainability, that big ambiguous word. What will be the impact of this decision on our planet, on me, on future generations? Seeing the world through a lens of sustainability. And then the other, seems to me we're going to have to set aside perhaps some of our selfish instincts and learn to work together and share information and help each other and be kind like never before. Maybe that means setting aside some of our competitive, selfish instincts. It's a major paradigm shift, but it seems to me this situation is requiring us to work together like never before. I love this painting. It's a painting that it was created by Ted Stockless, an artist up in Twillingate, and it hangs at the home of my sister Pauline and her husband Phil. See, they're pulling together a whole bunch of people, tugging together to move a house over a frozen harbor, which apparently was just the thing that was done years ago when someone needed help. Everybody joined in and pulled together and got the job done. When it comes to climate change, I think that's a pretty good analogy. Pulling together. I think there's a place, all of us in there, people in agriculture and everyone else who works in a less noble profession. With that, I'll wrap it up. I'll turn it back to Ivan if there are questions or comments, if there's time for that. But thank you so much. I'd like to thank the Federation, thank Kalisha in particular, for having given me this opportunity to be with you today, hopefully in person another time.
Carl, that was wonderful. Thanks so much. And I really appreciate you taking us through the emotional plateaus there of the concern about what is happening. But instead of just being immobilized by the fear of the future, you're suggesting some individual things that people can do, nibbling away at it. And you do a lot of writing for the public and so on. You made reference to, how do you find hope, the stress and mental health issues. Do you find that, do you have suggestions about how you advise people how to approach this huge global problem from your basement or wherever you are, or your barnyard? Is that a challenge that you deal with?
It is, Ivan. Of course, I do a lot of my presentations to school audiences, and it hurts to hear more and more angst creeping in among young people. And when it comes to that, I always say, the best thing you can do is at least to do something, to not feel paralyzed and immobilized, but choose to do something and jump into it and make a difference. Because the best solution is to be able to do something. And in school presentations, the three options that I usually present at the end in terms of actions: number one, get to know your carbon footprint. So become more energy literate and become aware of just all of your usage of resources. Number two, be open to changing your normal. So that means be open to making some changes in normal. And who knows, you might be surprised that they are actually pretty nice. I've mentioned about the paradigms that I've had to change over the last dozen years. Good heavens, my little garden at home gets bigger every year. We have chickens in the backyard now, and I think, wasn't that what kind of the granolas back at the granola club back at the agricultural college, the sustainable agriculture college years ago, were talking about? Maybe they had it right. But the nice thing that comes out of this is I find myself having an awful lot of satisfaction from thinking, I'm lowering my carbon footprint here. I'm having fun doing it. That little patch of soil is way better off thanks to the management. It's so prolific. It's teaching me how much our soil can give. So be open to changing your normal. And number three is to get involved. I do think that we as a culture tend to be fairly laid back in that we are quiet. We choose not to be too engaged. And I'll often put up a quote, one of my favorite quotes of Grammy Award-winning singer Kathy Mattea. She said, and I found it on her blog once, and it hit me right here, right here. And she said, I'm a reluctant activist. I don't want to rock the boat, but the universe keeps putting this stuff on my plate in a way that I can't ignore, and I don't want to be quiet anymore in any way. That drives me too. So in other words, I counsel people, look, it may feel a little uncomfortable, but become active. Maybe more than before. It's another paradigm that will be challenged. But big thing, long answer, Ivan, the big thing is to do something, because something is always better than not doing something.
Thanks. There's some great comments have been coming in, and Melvin's been talking about how he's been rethinking some of the processes on his own farm and what could be done better. I think if somebody has a short question or something that they'd like to ask to Carl, I think I want to give him a chance to respond to that. Just unmute yourself and fire away. Is there anyone who would like to ask something in particular? You can certainly continue to go on the chat and put things on there as well. Yes, Philip, I see his hand.
Carl, interesting talk. Well, I was at a level 9 before. I'm at a level 10 now. There's a proposed energy plant that's supposed to go in Lewisport, right next to my farm. And it's an environmental disaster in my view. I need some support to get rid of the proposed plant before it does enormous damage. It's a proposal to change biomass into so-called green energy, meaning a biofuel. And and this is from worldwide sources, and turn it into diesel fuel plus chemicals. And I just don't see that as being green in the least. There's a couple of stacks, which is going to put CO2 and many other things closer to the Greenland ice sheet. They're proposing to bring waste from the UK and Europe and Canada and put it through a hydrothermal process to produce this fuel and also to burn it to drive a steam turbine. All technology that belongs with 1800 and has got us into this mess. We need help to get rid of that proposal before it actually comes in place. And we've got to learn to handle our own waste in our own backyard and shorten up these loops of trucking crap around the world and trucking food around the world. We need to shorten these loops. Producer, consumer, just like you with your chickens, has to be in the same area. We have to get consumption and production as short as loops as we can, and we've got to deal with the waste where we can. And those bio wastes should be turned into soil, not burned. It just boggles my mind that someone can even propose it in this day and age.
You have a response to that, Carl?
Well, I'm not familiar with that plant, Philip, but look, my email is on the screen, and I'd be happy to chat with you offline after to learn a little bit more about it. It seems to me there's a lot of snake oil out there when it comes to green energy. You know, one quick example here in New Brunswick, we have a port up in Baldoon. The port was just off of that photo that I showed earlier. Its biggest export is wood pellets, which apparently go to Europe where they're burned to turn into electricity. Its biggest import is coal for the power plant right next door. And you say, wait a minute, is it just me or is there something a little funny about that? It seems to me the ultimate measure of sustainability is something called life cycle assessment. And that means, look, an honest, fair, evidence and database assessment of something from start to finish. Factor everything in. And that gives you the honesty, it seems to me, that we need to go forward. I mean, we can fool ourselves a lot, but the climate's based on math and physics. It's not going to be fooled, right? So all that to say, Philip, appreciate your passion on that issue. And
Okay,
you see my email there. Be happy to hear from you.
One other quick comment. I've been racking my brains to try and come up with a mower that would turn bio waste, the lawn, into something pelletized that I could either feed or spread. And God damn it, I turn around and the goat's there. And I'm saying, what in the hell are you doing? There's an animal that can chew up that grass, produce meat and milk and a beast of affection, and entertain my kids. And it puts out little pellets of carbon-containing fertilizer for my fields. I'm mad to be thinking of a machine to do this job. I've got that wonderful, wonderful goat. And I'm looking at this biomass to energy conversion plant, and I'm thinking exactly the same thing. Come on. Don't you know what's right in front of your eyes? Right there, God has provided us with a creature that can not only do that, he can play with your kids. He can give you milk, he can give you meat. Yeah. And here we are turning our noses up at that for some strange reason and thinking we have to invent some toy to do something. It just boggles my mind.
Well, Philip, it sounds like you should write a folk song about the magic goat that would sort of replace the mobile goat, which is the old Newfoundland folk song.
Well, there we go.
Yeah. Thanks so much. And thanks, Carl. And again, anybody who wants to, his email's on the screen there, and sign up for his newsletter as well. And keep putting stuff in your chat. And I really very much appreciate your approach and your content. And I'm glad that you make yourself available to people who have other questions. So once again, a big thanks, and however you could do it on Zoom or, send them a check or what. No, nobody uses checks anymore. I was in a store the other day, somebody was writing a check. We were all looking like, how? I didn't realize this happened.